Today, we find ourselves on the borders of Germania nearly 2 millennia ago. It is the year 100 AD, or 853 of the Roman calendar. 8 decades have passed since the end of the bloody Germanic Wars, and the region has finally started to heal. In contrast to Hollywood depictions of the frontier, the legions are not locked in an endless fight against hordes of barbarians which threaten to overrun civilization. Such events are extraordinarily rare and grossly caricatured. Instead, life on the Roman frontier is of a far tamer nature. Indeed, the region teems with a rich tapestry of history which all too often goes overlooked. In this series, we will seek to explore what this Pax Romana was actually like at the ground level by bringing to life a series of stories set across the frontier. These include patrols beyond the walls, life in a fort, duty in a watchtower, writing letters home, and taking time off for the holidays. This is daily life on the Roman frontier.
As we'll see in today's episode, history requires a lot of nuance, but it's unfortunate that much of the way history is presented today can be botched, sensationalized, and corporatized, to the point that truth is heavily distorted. And the same thing happens with the news we consume every day. That's why it's so important to take a closer look, question the narrative, and seek out the full picture, just like we do on the channel. And this brings us to today's sponsor, Ground News. They're an app and website that allows you to become an informed consumer of the news. Unlike modern trends that aim to sensationalize and distill reality into propaganda-like soundbites, Ground News does the opposite. Their mission is to give you the tools to think critically, consider nuance, identify bias, and think for yourself. And you can check them out in the link below at ground.news/Invicta. Now, as a practical example, let's explore this story, the claim that a mass grave of Roman-era fighters was found in Vienna linked to a 1st century battle. So already a topic I would be interested in learning more about. Now, Ground News gives me some great tools to dive in deeper. First is going to be bias distribution. So you can see here most reporting sources are center. I can go ahead and find out who they are, but this is already a great sign that I'm not seeing a big skew to one side or the other, which means that I'm not necessarily going to be subject to big threats of politicization. In addition, I can go down here and see that there is a high factuality rating for these articles, 48% being very high. Furthermore, I could break it down by ownership. Potentially, I might want to get something out of media conglomerates, so I might look at government reporting or independent reporting. So I get all these different slicers, and you have the ability to tweak which headlines are being pushed to you here. Now let's look at some headlines at our disposal. The first one here, American Military News. It does lean right, so it falls into this category, but very high factuality. And you can see the title here is very deadpan, very facts only. 129 bodies have been found under a soccer field. Versus if I go left, this one has a little bit more of a twist to it in that they try and tie the story overall back to the birth of Vienna. So there may be some other through lines that they're trying to put into this article other than just the facts. So as you can see with this example, Ground News gives you a great 360-degree perspective on stories to understand different perspectives and their potential biases. But they actually have a lot of other perks. For instance, my favorite feature is the blind spot feed. It helps you stay aware of what's going on outside your usual sources, and it's a great way to ensure that you're never blindsided by information you didn't even know you were missing. I honestly love Ground News and think they've created one of the most powerful and easy to use tools to survive in our age of misinformation. So if you want to maintain a healthy media diet, head to ground.news/Invicta or scan the QR code on screen to transform how you read the news. That's ground.news/Invicta. Without a doubt, Ground News has become one of the greatest upgrades to my online life, and I really recommend that you check it out.
The Germanic frontier had been forged in the early 1st century AD as a result of massive Roman campaigns against the tribes of the north. In such matters, the Rhine and Danube rivers proved to be convenient natural boundaries behind which the legions could rally to safeguard the interior provinces whilst standing ready to strike out beyond them. Thus it was that over the centuries, a vast military infrastructure project, known today as the Limes Germanicus, was developed to control this key region. But rather than manifesting as a continuous, impenetrable wall, this nearly 600-kilometer-long border is better described as a porous network meant to provide defense in depth. At the core of this system were the permanent legionary bases, whose grand castles acted as the operational and logistical hubs for the Roman military. Each controlled a roughly 50 to 100 kilometer wide sector at the front, yet alone, this task would be impossible. Thus it was that radiating out from these defensive hardpoints were webs of roads, walls, watchtowers, and forts meant to maximize the influence of each local army group. Given this fact, it quickly becomes evident that Roman and auxiliary units deployed to the area actually spent quite little time bottled up in their major fortresses. After all, such concentrations were only necessary for the waging of large campaigns in times of all-out war. But these instances were rare. Rather, in the times of peace or low-level conflict, which largely defined the era, the troops would far more commonly find themselves dispersed across the frontier. Thus, to truly understand what it was like to serve on the Germanic frontier, let us now take a closer look at life in these minor facilities. As we zoom into the Germanic limes, we can first center ourselves around a theoretical legionary fortress. As previously mentioned, it acts as the hub of local defensive operations. Branching out from it will be roads which connect to smaller auxiliary fortresses and fortlets. These came in many shapes and sizes depending on the occupants. For instance, a cohort-sized unit of 500 infantry would require quite substantial barracks and armories, while a cavalry ala would require stables and grazing fields, and a naval force would require docks and shipyards. In our case, we shall assume a relatively small base in the manner of the Limes Fort Pole reconstruction in Germany. It measures some 60 by 45 meters with the layout of a miniature legionary base. The four sides feature an outer ditch with earthen embankments topped by wooden walls. An external tower grants heightened visibility and protection. Meanwhile, a small gatehouse allows for access to the interior. Within, one will find a central structure with barracks and storage rooms. Additional features include a well and a wood-cutting station. All in all, it is a rather humble facility. Here, we can imagine that a century-sized unit of about 100 men might be headquartered. Again, we should note that this fort only had a portion of its total strength present at any given time. About 30 to 50 men were suitable as a skeleton to secure the base, while the rest of their number might be further dispersed in watchtowers, out on patrols, or off on leave. With this in mind, let's see what daily life was like for the men on duty. Mornings would have begun by waking up in the barracks. Typical rooms housed about 8 soldiers. The accommodations were sparse, with most of the space being used up by beds that were either crammed together or stacked on top of one another. Personal items might be hung from the wall or stored under one's bed frame. Upon waking up, soldiers would dress and have a quick breakfast. By tradition, this was a light meal that would be prepared by individual troopers or their roommates. With little room to spare, such meals were had either sitting or standing, rather than being enjoyed in the more aristocratic manner of dining while reclined. Other small tasks often accompanied these first waking hours. This might include bringing in firewood or drawing up water from the well. Soon, the troops would go about their assigned duties. Among the most common tasks would have been taking up the watch. In the military world, night and day were each broken up into 4 equivalent parts. One would be considered lucky to be assigned a day shift. But the army would go through regular rotations to make sure that every person had his turn at night. Timings of such duties were kept by a water clock and judiciously maintained. Men found to be late to their shift or lacking in their level of alertness could be subject to reprimand. Apparently, to fall asleep on watch, especially whilst on campaign, was a severe offence which might even be met with execution. Soldiers assigned to the walls would therefore have kept themselves busy by patrolling the perimeter. In theory, this meant being ready to spot and repel assailants at all times. But zoning out or making small talk with friends was fairly common behaviour. Those stationed above in the watchtowers, meanwhile, kept a sharp eye on the surroundings, looking for signs of the enemy or other activities worth reporting. Good practice would have been to regularly check in on the other Roman forts and towers which were within eyesight. After all, their position had been specifically chosen to relay visual messages between one another using fire and smoke signals. Should something noteworthy be detected, a watchman on the tower could quickly light their own beacon and sound the trumpets. And finally, those assigned watch duty at the gates would protect the fort's most critical point of entry. More often than not, though, they dealt with the mundane task of policing access in and out of the fort by military and civilian personnel. But watch shifts only lasted about 3 hours. The rest of one's day would be filled by other duties. These were often aimed at maintaining the readiness of the fort, its supplies and its men. In terms of the fort upkeep, troops would be used as labour to carry out a variety of tasks such as shoring up a weakening section of the earthen wall, repairing roofing that had been damaged in a storm, or regularly cleaning out the buildings and latrines. The grounds around the fort were also subject to upkeep. For instance, foliage which blocked one's line of sight might have to be cleared, while nearby trees would be felled for construction and firewood. In terms of equipment, it was each man's duty to see to the maintenance of their own arms and armour. However, much was also shared in common in the fort's armoury. Here, the unit would keep spares, repair kits, ammunition, and more. Everything had to be properly counted and routinely inspected for rust or degradation. Specialty gear such as ballistae would also be subject to a unit's attention. While not often deployed for combat, when the moment came, this was not a piece of equipment one wished to have fail. Thus, engineers paid special attention to testing and maintaining such pieces. In a similar manner, troops could also find themselves working with the unit's quartermaster to make sure the supplies of food and drink were equally well maintained. And finally, the bodies of the troops themselves were expected to be maintained. This involved regular training and exercise routines meant to keep them fit and sharp. Larger forts actually had extensive training areas and even interior spaces for use in cold or inclement weather. There might even be a bathhouse for rejuvenation and relaxation. Beyond what we have described, there were likely even more duties to fill the hours of the day. Indeed, as is always the case with officers in the army, there will always be something that needs doing. Even if it means hand-painting every pebble in the yard again. But we should also point out that a unit's duties extended beyond the walls of the fort. Patrols, for instance, were regularly sent out to gather intelligence and project power into the surrounding regions. Other duties might include marching out to serve on rotation in one of the neighbouring forts or watchtowers. Such assignments would have been good for the men as ways to stretch their legs and get some fresh air. It was also a critical part of keeping the defences of the frontier synced up with one another in an age before mechanised travel or telecommunications. Yet we should not imagine that Roman soldiers were inexhaustible. They were very much human, with a need for some off time. Just as today, much of this could be had by socialising with one's brothers in arms. Gaming was a regular feature of a soldier's life. This was often merged with a habit of gambling. Most officers turned a blind eye to such a vice, but in its extremes, a crackdown would be necessary. We can also expect soldiers to have taken time off for themselves, either relaxing in their bunks or visiting friends and family on leave. There would also be things to do in the local area. Inns to be frequented, spas to be patronised, and temples to be honoured. But it wasn't just the soldiers who travelled to and from the fort. Merchants and tradesfolk also made regular stops at these locations. This is evidenced by ancient records which map regions according to the landmarks along its major routes in a manner similar to modern subway diagrams. As an example, they might look something like this. Once you take the northern road for 30 miles, you'll arrive at the post of the first Thracians, where you can fetch a good price for pepper. Then, if you go west along the road for 50 miles, you'll arrive at the posting for the Batavian Ala, who pay extra for high-quality beer. Over time, the presence of these permanent forts would be woven into the fabric of life in the region. The troops had needs, and they had coin. Thus, markets soon popped up in their vicinity to provide goods and services. From this exchange of commerce came broader social mixing. Officers, for instance, might soon find themselves acting as de facto judges in local quarrels, and soldiers might take local wives and start families in the area upon retirement. Over the generations, we see fascinating evidence of cultural and religious blending in these border regions, which might manifest through Creole languages and hybridized gods. Thus, I hope we have helped provide you with a more nuanced understanding of what life was actually like for soldiers on the Germanic frontier. In the rest of this series, we offer more highlights of Roman service with stories of manning a watchtower, writing letters home, and going on leave. The Rhine had long stood as a natural boundary between peoples of the north, owing to its inherent geographic defences. Thus, it was that the borders of the Roman Empire would come to rest along its banks. Yet the might of Germania could not be kept in check by a mere river. The legions, therefore, set about reinforcing this frontier with a series of fortresses to host their garrisons and act as staging points for both offensive and defensive military campaigns. These would be linked by a vast network of outposts walls, forts, and roads, which together formed the bastion of the Germanic limes. Today, let us join a group of legionaries as they take their vigil on the front line of the Roman Empire. Once again, we find ourselves along the Rhine frontier in 100 AD. The local legionary fortress here is responsible for its nearest sector of the border. As such, it routinely sends soldiers out on rotation to man the various positions along the front. Now, a group of Germanic auxiliaries prepares to take their turn at a nearby watchtower. Because they will be rotating to the front through potentially hostile land to take up active duty, the soldiers will be expected to don their war gear. This step-by-step process will have become habitual by this point. The base layer was all about comfort. First came the tunic, leggings, and neck scarf, meant to protect one's skin from the elements and chafing of the armor. Next came a padded vest that would be worn on top of the soldier's tunic. Its purpose was to add an extra layer of protection from the wear and tear of the armor, and to more evenly distribute its weight. The soldier in this case dons a mail shirt. The standard Roman armor was generally lorica hamata, a mail shirt with extra shoulder reinforcement. Contrary to popular belief and Hollywood depictions, mail was both durable and effective, versatile enough for any combat situation. It provided a good defense against cutting, stabbing, and shocking attacks, especially when combined with padding underneath. Such pieces could be quite expensive though, when produced on a one-off basis, but the mass manufacturing practices of Rome's military-industrial complex helped make them more readily accessible to all. Besides this were also other types of gear that could be worn. The famed lorica segmentata, for instance, made its appearance along the Rhine frontier. It was a quite intricate set of armor, with many overlapping pieces that gave it excellent protective qualities. However, the sheer complexity of the lorica segmentata could make it harder to produce and maintain, and thus, while iconic, it was not as commonly used as one might expect from its near-universal depiction in media. By contrast would be the ubiquitous adoption of scale armor. This was a simple but effective design used by a wide range of cultures across the world. Thus, foreign auxiliaries often favored a type of bronze scale shirt known to the Romans as the lorica squamata. Once a soldier had donned his selected armor, he would then strap on his sword. For most infantrymen, this would hang on the right side where it would not interfere with his shield. After this would come the belt. While it may appear to protect the groin, testing has shown it to be of limited efficacy. Instead, these belts were used as status symbols. They were the main identifier for Roman soldiers, which was worn even alongside casual fatigues, and could often be highly decorated to show off. Next came the helmet. Beneath it would be worn a soft cap, meant once again to add a layer of comfortable padding between the skin and metal to dampen blows to the head, as well as to ensure a close fit. The helmet itself might be hung from one's neck when not expecting combat. However, to be fully prepared, it would be worn on the head and securely attached. Note the design's face and ear openings, meant to allow the soldier to maintain as much environmental awareness as possible. Finally would come one's shield and spear. The auxiliary is ready for duty. For long marches on campaign, additional gear and provisions would be packed in order to be as self-sufficient as possible. However, garrison duty did not have the same requirements. In this case, the watchtower is but a short day's march from the camp and will have all the supplies a troop will need. The soldiers, therefore, can travel far more lightly than usual, with their kit consisting primarily of war gear and a few personal items. The group of auxiliaries now set off through the wooded trail towards the watchtower. As they march, let us jump ahead of them to a discussion of the fortifications of the Rhine. These were not a simple linear set of walls. Rather, the Germanic limes were more akin to a network meant to provide defense in depth, which had developed organically over the centuries. At the core of this system were the permanent legionary and auxiliary bases meant to act as the operational hubs for the Roman military. Radiating out from these defensive hardpoints were webs of roads, walls, and forts meant to maximize the influence of each local army group. In this way, just a few thousand men could theoretically control hundreds of miles of vast frontier. However, the efficacy of this system was predicated on Rome's ability to allocate its limited resources to the right place at the right time. Information was the true key to security. Thus it was that an extensive system of watchtowers was established. These were placed at strategic intervals along the frontier to simultaneously provide coverage of their immediate area and to communicate any major issues back to their parent base. From there, a skilled commander could assess the situation and delegate troops accordingly. Soldiers on these watchtowers worked shifts, like you might see on a modern oil rig. After about 2 weeks on duty, they were ready to get back to some semblance of civilization, returning to spend time with their friends and family at camp. While on duty, they were meant to keep a watchful eye on the horizon, staying vigilant for any signs of danger. By day, this might be indicated by columns of dust from armies on the march, or by night by the presence of campfires that might betray a great host on the move. Such sightings certainly did happen, especially in later centuries when large numbers of Germanic tribes began to migrate through the area, seeking new homes or fresh conquests. However, these sort of momentous events proved rare from the perspective of a single guard's shift. Boredom was one's true enemy. Watchtower duty proved quite dull for most troops, who were left isolated with only a small group of soldiers for weeks at a time. Naturally, men would find all manner of diversions to spend their hours, which might include playing dice or board games, and often gambling. As with all militaries throughout the ages, it was the job of the unit's officer to make sure that these distractions did not detract from their mission or lead to internal friction. Idle hands, after all, are the devil's playthings, and this goes doubly so for military men in confined quarters. One regular duty that did provide a well-needed outlet for men on watch was patrols. These would be carried out along the frontier roads, as well as any identified smuggling paths. After all, the true value of professional soldiers in times of peace was not to fight off invading armies, but to deter banditry and to catch any ill-meaning trespassers. On this occasion, a pair of Germanic travelers is making their way across the border. Commerce is certainly allowed, but passing through checkpoints comes with pesky things like taxes and inspections for contraband. The two men therefore attempt to make their way around the major crossing points. Watchtowers, however, make this difficult, and they now attempt to dodge around one. Even if a man atop the walkway sees them, they will have a head start to mount an escape. Unfortunately for them, a patrol on the ground is already moving in their direction and makes a hasty pursuit. The smugglers do not get far and surrender rather than risking their lives. With one soldier keeping watch, the other immediately begins a search and seizure operation. They uncover Roman steel meant for illegal sale to the tribes beyond the Rhine. The pair are thrown in cuffs, and the patrol brings them back to the watchtower for processing. Here, the local commander interrogates them and begins to write a report on his wax tablet. If the matter is urgent, such reports can be sent up the chain by way of swift rider. However, on this occasion, the commander knows that the next rotation of guards is inbound. When his men are relieved, they will be able to escort both the report and the criminals back to the nearest base where their fate will be determined. As in our earlier episodes on criminal justice in ancient Rome, there was no time-out system by way of permanent prisons. Rather, criminals would face immediate consequences, with justice ranging from a simple fine to horrific corporeal punishment or enslavement. But watchtowers were not just places from which Rome could oppress the land. They also served as a useful bastion of government where locals could come seeking help. Whereas legionary fortresses, staffed by foreigners, might be too far off or simply too intimidating for your common villager to approach, watchtowers, often manned by local auxiliaries, would be far more accessible. The guards there had a high likelihood of speaking the native language and might even have personal connections to the locals. This made for a far more friendly encounter, which might actually see Imperial troops help a local shepherd woman find her lost sheep or a runaway child. And so the next rotation of soldiers makes its way to the Roman front lines. Not to fight endless hordes of barbarians, but to hurry up and watch the grass grow. As with all things in the military, 99% of the job is mindless boredom, with that last, random 1% being sheer terror. This was, and always will be, the life of soldiers on duty. Scouts of the Roman army were the unsung heroes of its armed forces who helped probe the darkness to detect threats and locate prey for the legions. Operating in the shadows of the past, they leave little trace in our historical records and receive even less attention in modern media. But today, it will be our goal to shine a spotlight on these ancient reconnaissance forces by bringing to life the Scouts of Rome. The Roman legion did the fighting while the logistics train did the feeding. Each was a marvel of its time, and, in theory, the two could work together to defeat almost any foe. But without eyes and ears to guide them, both would stumble ahead blindly, risking delay, dysfunction, and death. This was especially true in a world which lacked detailed maps and which was perpetually shrouded in a thick fog of war. Thus, it was imperative for a properly functioning Roman army to establish a robust system of military intelligence. But how is this achieved? In the years of the young Republic, Roman scouting was quite immature and ad hoc. Its flaws had led to a series of terrible defeats over the years. But by the late Republic, many lessons had been learned, and new means and methods were implemented. This would all be increasingly standardized as the Roman army transitioned to a fully professional force. Standard doctrine of the early imperial era called for armies to deploy a reconnaissance network composed of 3 layers. The first involved the procursores, who patrolled within a day's march of the main army. The procursores were not some specialized elite scouting unit. Rather, they were merely a group of troops who had been selected from the main army to fill the role as the situation demanded. As a result, their composition varied greatly. Whilst deployed, the procursores primarily acted as a close screen for the army, who would make contact with any nearby forces. These patrols were maintained day and night, with their frequency being increased in dangerous territory. As such, they could intercept deserters, informants, enemy scouts, and troops. In addition, the procursores could help act as pathfinders for the next day's march and might assist in foraging operations. The next reconnaissance group involved the exploratores, who acted as an outer ring of scouts which operated several days' march beyond the main army. These exploratores would be expected to report back everything that they could, especially details of terrain in a certain direction, any signs of enemy activity, and they would be expected to plot out a site for the nightly marching camp of the legions. They would also be equipped to potentially skirmish against any enemy scouts that they could not avoid. As with the Procursores, the Exploratores tended to be lightly equipped cavalry troopers, selected for an ad hoc assignment rather than on any permanent basis. Oftentimes, the soldiers would be chosen from among the auxiliaries who made up the bulk of Rome's cavalry forces. However, this was not always the case. In Trajan's Dacian Wars, legionaries themselves were picked for the job. By the later empire, however, it does seem that the Exploratores were eventually organized into their own formalized units. Whatever the case, the men in question would have been screened for possessing the necessary skills and experience, given the importance of the task at hand. The final reconnaissance group involved the Speculatores, who were more akin to spies that operated far beyond the army, often conducting missions within enemy territory. These agents appear to have been selected for service on the basis of their loyalty and discretion. They were likely recruited on an ad hoc basis with little in the way of standardization. After all, spies had been a feature of Roman warfare for quite a while, and groups of Speculatores came in all sorts of shapes and sizes. It's only later on, during the imperial era, that we start to hear of the formalization of this institution. Supposedly, there were 10 undercover agents attached to each legion, with the individual spies reporting up through the regular chain of command. Together, these three groups were capable of providing excellent reconnaissance service for the Roman army. For now, let us take a closer look at the mid-range scouts. The size of such a force varied greatly depending on the needs of its commander. Minor campaigns and garrison posts might make do with a handful or few dozen of such men. However, on a major military excursion, their numbers could be significant. One excerpt from a surviving source claims that, in his Persian campaign, the Emperor Julianus employed about 1,500 scouts to guide his army. For our scenario, we shall return to our border commander, who has a rather limited supply of manpower. He has received some reports of unrest in the region and plans to march out with the armed units in a show of force. The area is reasonably well known to the commander, as the Romans have been in the region for some time. Perhaps a crude map with routes linking villages and landmarks has already been prepared. This will certainly be useful for planning his operations. Even so, the region has been known to harbour raiders and other locals who have historically been hostile to soldiers of the Empire. Caution will be required. The legate, therefore, makes the prudent decision to send out men to scout the anticipated marching route. Specifically, he would like them to locate a suitable fording point for the river, which has seen recent flooding, to sniff out potential ambushes in the narrow mountain path, and to generally take notes on details relevant for the main body's advance, such as campsites, foraging opportunities, and fresh water supplies. For this mission, about a dozen men will do. The task force is assembled by consulting with the officers to pick out the best men for the job. These will be soldiers who have relevant experience in such matters. All of them would be skilled at recognizing trails, local flora, landmarks, and worrying signs of an enemy presence. Ideally, at least one of them will have grown up in these lands and is familiar with the environment and the people. Once the men have been assembled and briefed, they will begin to prepare for the journey ahead. Such missions will last several days, if not weeks, beyond the support of the main Roman force. Thus, they must be self-reliant and come prepared to meet the unexpected challenges ahead. A basic soldier's kit would include weapons, armor, sleeping gear, cooking supplies, and rations. Scouts might choose to travel light, removing, swapping, or augmenting parts of their kit. For instance, it would be important to carry additional dried foods meant to last a while and to include utility equipment such as a rope. For the rest of their needs, they would have to live off the land. Such scout units might be expected to carry out their mission on foot. Other times, they might bring a mule to lug around their gear or might have their own horses to ride upon. The exact disposition of a scout group would vary based on their available resources and the nature of the mission. Mounted scouts were excellent for speed, but could not necessarily traverse the same types of terrain or remain as discreet as their dismounted counterparts. A hybrid scout force was often the best approach, and we hear from our sources of how the two could work in tandem in the field. For this particular mission, though, we have assumed that a small foot-based force of scouts has been deployed. Their first objective will be to locate a point to ford the local river, which is about a day's march from camp. Fords were often locally known, being essential to any sort of travel or trade. Bridges might exist at these crossing points. But such infrastructure could be expensive, and unless an emperor or governor had a good reason to spend the money and time to build a bridge, an army would often just find a relatively shallow spot in the river where they could cross. This would have the unfortunate side effect of making the entire army quite vulnerable. Additionally, if there had been a heavy storm recently, a ford could be washed away or change position entirely. Our scouts will begin by approaching the previously known fording point. Here, they assess the conditions and perhaps seek out a few alternatives. Suitable candidates will be both easy to cross and free of natural or human opposition. When the best path is decided upon, they will perhaps take some notes and leave some hidden markings for future reference before making the crossing themselves. After navigating the river and drying their feet, the scouts push on towards their next objective, the mountain pass. The journey ahead will be a multi-day trek across a forested region, with pockets of open prairies, ravines, and hills. Along the way, the men will periodically make camp and collect supplies. As they do so, they will make note of useful sources of water, timber, and forage. It will also be important for them to keep an eye out for locations where a larger force might be able to strike camp. Typically, these would be on elevated stretches of flat land with access to supplies. As the scouts approach the mountain pass, the forests begin to clear. Now they gain a better understanding of their surroundings and can begin to assess their location based on local landmarks. Perhaps a crude map will be used to reorient themselves towards the objective. Once properly oriented, they set off again. However, the sloping terrain and beating sun now slow their advance, and more regular breaks will be needed. And yet they press on, with eyes and ears open for potential signs of danger. As the scouts arrive at the feet of the mountain range, the ascent over brush and rock proves difficult. For an army, this might be considered impassable terrain, but for a small group of light scouts, there are few areas that are truly out of reach. By climbing a nearby ridgeline, the scouts are able to assess their surroundings. From here, they gain a clear view of the mountain pass objective, and can trace the most optimal routes the legions might take to reach it. This vantage point also allows them to scour the lowlands for signs of enemy activity. This might be anything from campfire smoke to dust clouds, bird flights, and more. But an enemy might not be so readily detected, and so the scouts may plan to spend a day or more looking for clues around the area. At first, not much seems amiss. Footprints along the path appear to have been left by a passing herdsman and his cattle, while an old campsite rutted by a small cart points to the passing of a merchant. Beyond this, the scouts find little evidence of suspicious activity. They therefore make a final sweep of the surroundings before heading back to camp. They retread much of the same path as before, refining their notes about the route. It is now that one of the troopers spots a fresh sign, a small column of smoke in the distance. The scouts decide to investigate, approaching the target with caution. As they draw near, the source of smoke becomes clear. A small pyre burns with the remains of a sacrificed animal. Someone has been seeking the favor of the gods, but for what purpose is unclear. An inspection of the nearby ground reveals the tracks of at least a dozen men, enough to cause trouble, and certainly more than this small unit can take on alone. Armed with this latest information, the scouts pull back. They now make haste back to camp. In this way would information from the field be collected. Such scouts with important information would be quickly referred to a high-ranking officer of the Legion, or even the legate in charge. They would be accompanied by a scribe, who would take down the report and perhaps even create an accompanying diagram. The contents of our mission, for instance, might be boiled down as follows. The river crossing by the rocks around the third bend is navigable. Recommend taking the northeastern trails, which are in good condition and have several suitable campsites. The mountain pass is clear of rock slides and any signs of ambushes. Potential signs of a raiding party of 12 men were discovered on the Ides, about 10 stades northwest of the Old Forest. But this is just speculation. One of the few clues we have of what an actual scout report may have looked like appears on a fragment from Vindolanda. The scrap, scrawled on a wooden tablet, states the following. The Britons were unprotected by armor. There are very many cavalry. The cavalry do not use swords, nor do the wretched Britons mount in order to throw javelins. But what the whole text said, or what its nature was, sadly remains a mystery. And so the work of Rome's ancient scouts remains hidden in the historical shadows. I miss you, Mum. It's been too long. Thanks for the care package. These are the familiar words penned by soldiers from the front lines. But while we might be familiar with such correspondences in our own time, what did it look like 2,000 years ago? Today, let's travel back to experience what it was like to send letters from the Roman front lines. The Roman army was stationed across the far corners of the ancient world, and while they are most famously known for the campaigns they conducted across these theatres of war, most of their time on the front was spent outside of combat. As we have covered previously, this involved training, patrolling, escorting, policing, watchtower duty, manual labor, and a host of other activities. Yet, even still, much of service life was filled with boring downtime. Thus, soldiers found every means to keep their spirits lifted. Often, this meant relaxing or socializing with their new friends in the army. Over decades spent in the service, these brothers-in-arms would become almost like family. But there was no replacement for one's true family. After all, the longing for home lay just as heavily on a soldier's heart as it does today. For some lucky soldiers, a homecoming might actually be possible if they were close enough to make it there and back within their approved period of leave. For many, though, posted hundreds of miles away, such a reunion would have to wait many years, if not decades. Thus it was that soldiers across the empire kept in touch by sending letters back home. But how was this achieved 2,000 years ago? For starters, we must address how a soldier would even go about writing a letter in the first place, given that literacy rates were certainly far lower than they are today. But how much so is a matter of academic debate. Ranges vary greatly from low model estimates of around 1% to high model estimates of around 20%. Naturally, these figures will rise and fall depending on definitions, time periods, locations, and demographics. Literacy among your average Roman soldier likely followed somewhat similar trends to the general public, with the upper ranks skewing towards the higher end of competency. And yet, while a random sampling of troops in camp might not yield someone capable of reading, let alone writing a letter, it would not have been hard to find someone who could. After all, the Roman army was a huge bureaucratic machine, powered by armies of scribes who handled most of the paperwork for things such as logistics, finances, and communications. Even if these folks were too busy to help you, then there would always be private merchants coming in and out of camp who might be of service. Such men swarmed over army camps looking for ways to make money, and the market for letter writing was likely always in high demand. So now that you found a friend, a scribe, or a merchant to write your letter, what would this process look like? Letters could be written on many mediums, such as wax tablets, wooden boards, or even hides. But sheets of papyrus seem to have been among the most common. These were widely produced and could be procured relatively cheaply. As for the writing utensil, a reed stylus, or calamus, was common. A scribe merely had to spend a minute whittling the tip into the correct shape. Once achieved, this pen would be dipped in carbon-based ink and used to write a few words before returning to the inkwell. As one might imagine, writing long letters could take a lot of time and resources. Thus, your rank-and-file correspondences were likely more short and sweet, while the elite could afford to wax on and on at their leisure. Julius Caesar is a famous example of a general who had entire tomes published whilst on campaign. In fact, the letter being written in this demonstration is an excerpt of just one page from his Gallic war commentaries. But supposing that a letter had been written, how was it sent? Well, for this, the Roman army was well equipped. The same roads which allowed troops to march efficiently across the empire also helped with the critical flow of information. Officials and the higher-ups could make use of the state postal system known as the cursus publicus. It involved a vast network of couriers and way stations ready to send messages from point A to B at a blistering speed of up to around 250 kilometers a day. In this way, a message from the Germanic frontier could reach Rome in as quickly as a week. Others had to rely on friends, slaves, or merchants who could not achieve the same level of expedited services. Nonetheless, it was still reasonable to expect that one's letter from Britain to Egypt could make the journey in about a month or two. But what chance did it have of landing in the right hands? Well, just as today, letters had an address by which to reach the intended recipient. Here are a few examples from surviving records. To Epimachus in Philadelphia from Apion, his son. Deliver at Caranis to Thesis from her son Apollinarius of Misenum. Deliver at the camp of the first cohort of the Apameni to Julianus, vice secretary, this letter from Apion to be forwarded to his father Epimachus. So now let's assume that a letter has finally arrived. What did it say? Well, just about anything. After all, evidence suggests that letter writing was quite common in antiquity, and therefore we can expect there to have been hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of correspondences which made their way across the ancient postal systems over the centuries. Unfortunately, most of these have been lost to time. A lucky few, however, have been preserved. Some owe their survival to the idea that prominent figures actually mass-produced their letters for public consumption. However, the private correspondences of everyday individuals survive mostly thanks to having been laid to rest in environments which have naturally preserved them. Among the most famous of these are the Vindolanda tablets. Several hundred of these were discovered in the bogs located next to a Roman camp, which seems to have been used as a trash heap of sorts. The documents record official military matters as well as personal messages to and from members of the garrison of Vindolanda, their families and their slaves. Here are a few select readings. From a family member to their son, quote, "I have sent you woolen socks, 2 pairs of sandals and 2 pairs of underpants." From a man to the commanding officer of the 9th cohort of Batavians, quote, "Hostilius Flavianus to his Cerialis, greetings. A fortunate and happy new year." From Claudia Severa to her sister Sullicia Lepidina, the wife of the same commander, quote, "Claudia Severa to her Lepidina, greetings. On 11 September, sister, for the day of the celebration of my birthday, I give you a warm invitation to make sure that you come to us, to make the day more enjoyable for me by your arrival, if you are present. Give my greetings to your Cerialis. My Elias and my little son send him their greetings. I shall expect you, sister. Farewell, sister, my dearest soul, as I hope to prosper and hail." From a decurion to his prefect, quote, "Masculus to his Veracundus, greetings. The Rhaetian men have asked me to request from you leave for 3 men of the Rhaetians who are under your charge, Liticus, Vitalis, and Victor, and from the Vacontii, Augustanus, Cusius, Bellicus. And I ask, my lord, that you order the return of the cleaving knife which is in the possession of Talampus, of the century of Nobilis, because it is needed by us. I have sent you the plants through Talio of the Peregriniana troop. I hope that you and yours enjoy good fortune. Farewell." From the same decurion in a later correspondence, quote, "Please, my lord, give instructions as to what you want us to have done tomorrow. Are we to return with the standard to the shrine at the crossroads altogether, or half of us? Most fortunate, and be well disposed towards me. Farewell." He then adds, quote, "My fellow soldiers have no beer. Please order some to be sent." Another priceless trove of documents comes from the Egyptian city of Oxyrhynchus, whose dry desert preserved hundreds of written records that made their way onto another trash heap. It is within this archaeological site that researchers have found a wealth of documents. These include fragments of texts pertaining to works of poetry, drama, history, mathematics, legalities, and administration. Discoveries like these from the sands of Egypt are still ongoing, but so far have uncovered several letters from soldiers serving afar in the Roman army. One of these comes from a man who had recently shipped out, quote, "Apollinarius to Thesis, his mother and lady, many greetings. Before all, I pray for your health. I myself am well, and make supplication for you before the gods of this place. I wish you to know, mother, that I arrived in Rome in good health on the 20th of the month Parcon, and was posted to Misenum, though I have not yet learned the name of my company, for I had gone to Misenum at the time of writing this letter. I beg you then, mother, look after yourself and do not worry about me, for I have come to a fine place. Please write me a letter about your welfare and that of my brothers and all of your folk. And whenever I find a messenger, I will write to you. Never will I be slow to write. Many salutations to my brothers and Apollinarius and his children, and Caralus and his children. I salute Ptolemaeus and Ptolemais and her children, and Heraclus and her children. I salute all who love you, each by name. I pray for your health. Here is a letter from a man named Apion, who also writes back upon transferring to Italy. Apion to his father and Lord Epimachus. Very many greetings. First of all, I hope you are in good health and that things are going well for you and my sister and her daughter and my brother. I thank the Lord Serapis for saving me straight away when I was in danger at sea. When I arrived at Port Misenum, I received 3 gold pieces from the emperor for traveling expenses, and I'm doing just fine. Now I ask you, my lord and father, write me a letter about your own well-being. Second, about that of my brother and sister. And third, so that I may devoutly greet your hand, because you brought me up well, and I may therefore hope for rapid promotion, the gods willing. Send my regards to Capiton and my brother and sister and Serenilla and my friends. I'm sending you my portrait through Euctemon. My new Roman name is Antonius Maximus. My company is Athenonica. I pray for your health. Another man by the name of Polion, however, seems to have had less luck corresponding with his family. I pray that you are in good health night and day, and I always make obeisance before all the gods on your behalf. I do not cease writing to you, but you do not have me in mind. But I do my part writing to you always, and do not cease bearing you in mind and having you in my heart. But you never wrote to me concerning your health, how you are doing. I am worried about you because although you received letters from me often, you never wrote back to me so that I may know how you are. He addresses other family members. I sent 6 letters to you. The moment you have me in mind, I shall obtain leave from the commander, and I shall come to you so that you may know that I am your brother. For I demanded nothing from you for the army, but I fault you because although I write to you, none of you has consideration. Alas, we shall never know what became of these soldiers or the rest of their comrades whose letters back home have been lost to the ages. Nonetheless, I hope that these echoes of their lives can help remind us of their humanity and help ground our understanding of the past through the shared experience of life. After all, it will only be a matter of time before we all pass through the sands of time as well. The fortresses which once served as the staging point for armies now act as hubs around which people from both sides of the Rhine mingle. In this regard, the summer months are the most active along the frontier. However, as the year draws to an end, things begin to slow down, and all must make ready for the coming of winter. It is during this period that troops typically begin to transition out of their active duties. Winter is a period of rest and recovery which all look forward to. Among the excited soldiers is a small group of Germanic auxiliaries, which has been granted leave for the season. They eagerly prepare for the trip home to enjoy some well-earned time off. Today, let us follow them in this journey beyond the Rhine. Preparing for an overnight trip was habitual for any Roman soldier. They were, after all, drilled to be human mules who carried enough gear on their backs to handle any eventuality. This kept the legions lean and mean. A well-made kit was a point of pride for a soldier of the Empire. Most small belongings, including survival gear and personal items, were stored in a sack, which was then tied on to the furka, the cross-shaped equivalent of a backpack. Next came a sleeping fur, which would be rolled up and tied to the furka. Finally, the dolabra was added, a simple yet versatile mattock responsible for many of Rome's incredible feats of engineering. After the furka was loaded, came an equally important step, storing one's shield. The wood and metal could be degraded by the elements, and thus a leather cover was used for protection while in transit or storage. Typically, it would only be removed when expecting combat. This was often the visual cue for scouts seeking to determine the intentions of an enemy army. But one's shield was not the only thing in need of protection from the elements. Winds, rains, and chills were a soldier's worst enemy on the march. They therefore dressed in layers, with cloaks being the perfect multi-purpose garment. Caps were also commonly worn, not just for their insulating properties, but as precautions to allow soldiers to quickly don their helmets if the need arose. By the second hour of the day, the troop is ready and sets off along the river towards the nearest main road. On the Roman side of the river, these are comfortably wide and well maintained. They make quick progress through the mists. Soon, however, as they gain distance from the land of the Romans, the path thins. But these men know the way, and their military sandals make it easy to traverse any terrain. As their bodies warm from exercise, the land likewise heats up with the rising sun, burning off the morning fog. It is now the 4th hour of the day. The troops have hit their stride and now make pace to easily travel 20 miles today. The conditioning of military service makes such feats routine, and so they advance toward their goal. But they are not alone. Alongside them are the herds of the pastures and wildlife of the prairies. In wartime, such livestock and game would have been quickly snapped up by the legions. Now, however, they graze peacefully. Their Germanic owners enjoy the tranquility near the border, where Roman guards deter bandits and merchants pay handsomely for the products of their livestock. At the 6th hour of the day, with the noonday sun beating down on them, the soldiers stop for a quick break. Though they are young and fit, their gear is heavy and the sun makes them feel every pound. As they nibble on some hard tack and make small talk, they begin to chat excitedly about the food which awaits them at home. This hastens their sense of urgency, and so the march resumes. By the 8th hour of the day, they have reached a large patch of forest that separates them from their homes. It will take more hours than they have remaining to cross it. Thus, with the sun beginning to set, the group decides to spend the night in a safe campsite they have used in the past. The first step will be to collect wood for fire and shelter. On campaign, military slaves or dedicated units of lignatores would do this work. But alone, it will be up to them. With these local resources, they strike a camp. The shelter, while rudimentary compared to the grand construction of legionary marching camps, should be sufficient for these 3 men in a peaceful region. One item that may help give them extra peace of mind will be their caltrops. These would provide a basic perimeter around the camp, giving the soldiers a layer of added security. The trap may alert them to the presence of a bandit or bear in the night and can be recovered in the morning to avoid causing unwanted collateral damage. While one man works on securing the camp, another starts a fire. The last man, meanwhile, begins the standard duty of chopping food for the pot. On a decently provisioned outing, their meal will typically involve basic vegetables such as beans, lentils, and onions, alongside small cuts of meat like salted pork or beef. These ingredients are durable and filling, perfect for men on the march who might be without a supply train. They are easily thrown together in a stew and flavored with salt, fat, and perhaps even some spices. While the food is filling on a caloric level, the monotony of eating the same basic army dish only makes them all the more eager to get home. For now, they pass the time daydreaming of the food of their mothers and joking about finally being away from the smell of that Roman sauce which stinks up the legionary camps. Eventually, the sun sets, and, with one keeping watch, the others easily fall asleep. The sun eventually rises on a new day. Rested and fed, they are ready to continue their journey. After another long march, they finally cross the forest and arrive home just in time for supper. Their families are overjoyed to see them and can't wait to catch up. The hungry soldiers are hurried inside, where they are greeted by the welcome smell of cookpots. Between heaping servings of homemade stew, conversation drifts from gossip to rumor, local news, and venting about the army drama of the year. Within just a few days, they find their spirits lifted. They make the rounds, catching up on everyone's lives and sharing their own adventures. It's good to be home. But just as they have begun to ease back into civilian life, duty calls. Their commanding officer had only given them a couple of weeks off, and the short winter days have flown by. All too soon, they must bid farewell to their friends and family. Once again, the soldiers make ready for the long walk back to their post. Luckily for them, it won't be too long before their next rotation home. They will return likely sometime in late spring, bringing more toys for the children and stories for the old men. In this way, hundreds of Germanic auxiliaries will serve Rome over the years, taking their turns in the vigil along the Rhine frontier. But this is no patriotic duty for some far-off emperor. Rather, their service is a practical form of employment which helps support their people across the river. For this community, the Roman peace is a blessing. Such is the often overlooked and nuanced reality of the Rhine frontier, which, for most of its existence, was a bastion of tranquility and coexistence. For centuries, the schemes of generals and the trumpeting of armies were but distant echoes in the wind for the common folk of this border region. I hope you've appreciated this topic. A huge thanks to the team at Imperium Romanum for their awesome reenactment work. I also wanted to shout out to the patrons who support the channel, as well as the researchers, writers, and artists who made our episodes a reality. Be sure to like and subscribe for more content, and check out these other related episodes. See you in the next one.